Hello, and welcome to Top Story Daily Edition. I'm JNS Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Todt. Thanks for joining me for another discussion on the most pressing issues in the Jewish world. Please like, subscribe, and give us good reviews when you listen to the show. Now let's get started. During its first years in office, the Biden administration had difficulty saying the words Abraham Accords, let alone taking actions to follow up and expand upon the Trump administration's foreign policy triumph. That's changed in the last several months. The Biden administration has taken up the cause of promoting a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But if those two countries are moving ever closer to each other, something about which there is no doubt, it has little to do with the efforts of President Joe Biden or Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The evidence of that closeness was clearly on display in the past week as two Israeli ministers and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government visited the Desert Kingdom. Tourism Minister Chaim Katz became the first member of Israel's cabinet to be granted an entry visa by the Saudis when he attended a conference of the UN World Tourism Organization there. This week, Communications Minister Shlomo Karhi arrived in Riyadh at the head of a 14-person delegation, including a fellow Knesset member and representatives of various other ministries. While there, they took part in a religious service for Sukkot. The pictures of an Israeli politician visiting Saudi Arabia dressed in a talit and holding a lulav and an etrog were amazing, especially when considering just how unimaginable such a thing would have been only a few years ago. But it was probably not as shocking as the willingness of that country's de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, to speak openly of normalization with Israel. During an interview held last month with Fox News Channel's Bret Baier, MBS dismissed the idea that efforts to bring the two countries closer had stalled. "Every day we get closer," he said. Obstacles, of course, remain before the realization of a normalization agreement, including the exchange of ambassadors. Moreover, there are still reasons to believe that MBS and the Saudis may be perfectly happy to grow ever closer to Israel as a strategic military ally against Iran and a potential business partner, without going all the way to a peace treaty. The symbolism that goes with such a decision remains tricky for a regime whose claim to legitimacy in the Arab world is that of the guardian of Islam's holy places in Mecca and Medina. Yet the main takeaway from this exchange is that the Biden administration was put in its place. Unlike the situation in 2020, when the Trump administration was the driving force between the diplomatic momentum that led to the Abraham Accords, Biden and Blinken may be as much of a hindrance to the Israel-Saudi relationship as they are a help. American diplomacy on this subject has highlighted how mired the veterans of the Obama administration, who still run foreign policy under Biden, are in failed policies of the past. Their insistence on including Israeli concessions to the Palestinians, coupled with reviving the dead-in-the-water peace process and the quest for a two-state solution to the conflict, indicate that they fail to understand why normalization is even possible in the first place. The Arab states, and MBS in particular, comprehend, as perhaps many in the U.S. foreign policy establishment and media still do not, that the Palestinians have no interest in peace with Israel. As such, they are tired of having their security and national interest being held hostage by a Palestinian political culture that cannot let go of its century-old war on Zionism. The American push to include the Palestinians in any deal is more about the Biden administration's desire to topple Netanyahu's government, since many of its members wouldn't tolerate sacrificing the Jewish state's rights in Judea and Samaria in order to buy an embassy in Riyadh than any pure-hearted interest in peace. That brings us back to what is driving Biden's recent interest in Israel-Saudi peace. He has two main objectives. One is a desire to keep the Saudis from turning to China for help with Iran and to help ensure the flow of oil to an America that discarded energy independence for environmentalist ideology, but now faces shortfalls due to the sanctions on Russia after it invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The second is for some sort of foreign policy success heading into the president's already shaky re-election campaign in which most national polls show that he is either tied with former President Trump or actually trailing him. This should not be confused with an election year pivot on Israel that was comparable to the one that former President Barack Obama executed in 2012. After 3 years of doing his best to create more daylight between the United States and Israel, as well as fomenting public spats with Netanyahu, Obama moved to quiet talk of a rift with the Jewish state as he headed into a tough re-election fight. What followed were speeches such as his address to the 2012 AIPAC Policy Conference, during which he pledged to ensure that Iran would never get a nuclear weapon. We now know that he was already plotting to betray those promises by initiating secret talks with Iran. But in public, he stuck to the script, even to the point of vowing in his 2012 foreign policy debate with Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney that any deal he struck with Iran would mean dismantling of its nuclear program. Those promises would be quickly forgotten once Obama was reelected, but his Israel charm offensive shored up his hold on the Jewish vote. He won 69% that year. That was down from 78% in 2008, but it was still deeply disappointing to Republicans, many of whom had wrongly assumed that a president who had made no secret of his antagonism for Israel would be punished at the polls by Jewish Democrats. But liberal Jews still backed him, even when he spent much of his second term working to appease Iran, something that culminated in the 2015 nuclear deal. Biden is not as worried about Jewish voters as Obama was. In America's current bifurcated political culture, the notion that a population as overwhelmingly liberal as the Jews would cross over to vote for a Republican, let alone Trump, over Israel or any other issue, is a pure fantasy. It's a source of immense frustration to Trump, who never tires of venting his anger over the fact that most Jews didn't consider his status as the most pro-Israel president ever to be a reason to vote for him. While politically conservative Jews and the Orthodox will support the former president, the Democrats know they don't have to do a thing, especially with regards to an Israel led by Netanyahu that many on the Jewish left dislike, in order to equal the 68% of the Jewish vote that Biden received in 2020. Nevertheless, Biden does want something he can call a foreign policy victory. To date, his main accomplishments abroad involve his disastrous retreat from Afghanistan and the way his blunders helped lead to the war in Ukraine. His priority coming into office was to revive Obama's nuclear deal that Trump had abandoned. But knowing that the new president was bent on appeasing rather than pressuring them, a fact that was reinforced by the way Biden's negotiating team was compromised by its pro-Iran bias, the Iranians refused to go along and have sat back and watched sanctions go unenforced. They also saw Biden resort to a ransom deal that brought them billions while they chipped away at making progress towards building their own nuclear weapon. As we learned this past week, Iran's nuclear program has now reached the point where it is now a given that the Iranians can assemble a bomb in less than 2 weeks, essentially ending in the failure of Western and Israeli efforts to prevent such an outcome. As MBS told Fox News, the Saudis won't sit by and allow their sworn enemies in Tehran to get a bomb without seeking one themselves. That's why the wish list they have handed the Americans earlier this year as the price for signing a normalization agreement, including U.S. assistance to create a Saudi nuclear program. That's never going to happen. Most Democrats despise the Saudis and wouldn't go along with a treaty guaranteeing their defense, another possible component of a normalization deal, even without helping the authoritarian monarchy in Riyadh to go nuclear. Saudis are willing to pay lip service to the Palestinians, but it's equally clear that MBS's government has zero interest in efforts to create another independent Palestinian Arab state besides the Hamas-run terrorist enclave in the Gaza Strip. In his interview with Bear, MBS spoke of wanting to ease the lives of Palestinians, but conspicuously left any mention of 2 states or Israeli territorial concessions. The only ones talking about those dubious objectives are Biden's team. This leaves the president caught in an interesting bind. He'd like a diplomatic win to boost his re-election chances, but the Biden team is too interested in undermining Netanyahu and in trying to somehow salvage their desire for a rapprochement with Iran, to return to a policy that weds the United States to its traditional Israeli and Saudi allies. That leaves Biden's Middle East policy a hopeless model. Nevertheless, as both Netanyahu and MBS have made clear, they don't need Washington to hold their hands in order for the two countries to grow closer. These two once unlikely friends were brought together by Obama's pivot to Iran and the nuclear dilemma, as well as their national interests. That will continue to bind them in an informal alliance that can thrive, even without a signed treaty. Thanks for listening. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition and every week for the full hour-long JNS TV program. Whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself.